A little bit about who I am. So I have about 8 years of working experience in technology. And in the past 8 years, I've been blessed and lucky enough to work at these 4 particular companies across Canada as well as in the US. GitHub for a couple of years, Modern Health, a mental health company for a couple of years, PagerDuty as well for a couple of years, and finally a fintech company. So luckily, I've had a range of different experiences from working at startups, smaller companies, and now at a larger company that I'm thankful to be able to share some of these experiences with you all today. So for today, what I'd be sharing is a little bit about what is Copilot and how it actually works. And I'll also be walking you through some of the experiences that I have designing for Copilot as a growth designer. And you'll be learning about some of the research that formulated the technical preview, which essentially is getting early access to Copilot and how that led to where Copilot is right now. And also some of the challenges that I personally faced as a designer as I've gone through the process of designing for Copilot. And lastly, I'm going to be sharing a little bit about Copilot and how it supported me in my journey to learning programming. And I'm just going to be talking a little bit about what GitHub Copilot is. And since some of you already know, this might be repetitive, but hopefully it's informative. GitHub Copilot essentially is an AI pair programming tool that assists users by suggesting entire lines of code, effectively supporting users with a lot of things like code completion and even writing documentation, as well as writing tests and being able to explain the code for you directly so that you have a better understanding instead of going to something like Stack Overflow. It's all integrated together into a tool that makes it a lot easier for you to understand. And essentially, it's been trained on natural language text as well as source code available from publicly available code, such as GitHub, some public repositories, and it was built in collaboration with OpenAI, GitHub, and Microsoft. And a lot of this is just around like natural language processing. More specifically, it uses OpenAI Codex, which is a machine learning model that basically uses a neural network and is capable of generating natural language text, kind of similar to ChatGPT. And it takes the knowledge from being trained on billions of lines of code from publicly available data, and it helps you to take that and understand the lines of code that you're generating directly in your file editor as you're learning programming. And most notably, it's really powerful on certain languages such as Python, JavaScript, TypeScript, Ruby. It is accessible for a wide range of different languages, but it's most powerful on very specific ones. So essentially it analyzes the context of what you're editing in your editor as well as related files and just offers very relevant suggestions. But big caveat, it's not perfect, which I'll mention a little bit later on in the presentation. But overall, just very briefly, you can download it as an extension using supported IDEs. And these are 5 examples of IDEs that you can use. So VS Code, JetBrains, NeoVim, as well as Azure. So overall, what I'm going to be chatting about, as I mentioned, is a little bit about my experience here with designing Copilot as a growth designer. And I just also want to be clear that, of course, other teams at GitHub were also involved in designing Copilot. Copilot is a huge initiative that involves a lot of different moving pieces, from PMM to product design to marketing to legal and many more. So it's not only just me, but I'd love to highlight only my experiences with design. And I'll share a little bit of a story of how I started. So around last year in April 2022, I first started working for GitHub. And around that time, GitHub was doing something of a technical preview, which is more like an early access program for, I think, 1.2 million developers who are interested in getting early access to Copilot for the first time. And honestly, at the time, we weren't sure as a company whether Copilot was going to be successful. We just wanted to have the experience for developers to try it out so that they have an opportunity to improve their efficiency and move faster and be able to code with hopefully a higher accuracy. And it was always a question, was it going to be successful? So we did the technical preview for 1 year, which officially ended in June last year, to fully understand how effective Copilot was going to be. And actually the results were great. And it ended up being a huge success, in my opinion, for how well it was received. And of course, I think when you hear about AI, you might have some questions around whether it's going to steal your jobs or something like that. You might have some doubts. And I think when we also launched it, I think there were questions around, is it going to be a success or is it going to be a flop? And so the technical preview really offered a lot of information. And this was some of the research that came out of the GitHub Copilot research team. And you can see from this particular chart that people were mentioning like there's perceived productivity, that developers are feeling like they're a lot more productive when they're actually using Copilot. They're less frustrated when coding and more fulfilled, and they have just higher efficiency and flow when working on it. Because essentially what we realize is that when developers are coding and they're doing programming, they're also bogged down by other things like writing tests or working on pieces of infrastructure, reviewing other people's code. And all these things take away from the actual work. But what they really care about is doing the creative work and being able to think more deeply about specific problems that they're interested in solving. What Copilot does really well is reduces all the boilerplate code and all the redundancies and the mundane things that they don't want to have to do over and over again, and makes people more productive. And this is what we found in the research here. I think in this research, 60% were developers and 30% were students, and the rest of the 10% were hobbyists. But you can see that a lot of people were very excited about Copilot. And the top 3 ways that users really leverage Copilot is everyday coding in familiar languages, writing the same repetitive code in the exact same languages. And also a lot of students were interested in exploring new languages, frameworks, or APIs as a way to learn from Copilot. And here's a quote from an engineer who mentioned, with Copilot, I get to think less, and when I have to think, it's the fun stuff. It sets off a little spark that makes coding much more fun and more efficient. And I think ultimately, after the technical preview was finished, I think it kind of led us to this fork in the road where we're wondering, well, how do we create alignment across GitHub teams so that Copilot can be launched for everybody? Because it was a success for the technical preview, we now wanted it to be just widely available for all users. And here is what we actually discovered with that. We realized that to actually make GitHub Copilot accessible for all users, we had a ton of work to do. From the design standpoint, we had a marketing page, we had the IDE experience, we had the product design experience in the product. Then we had promotions that we wanted to do on GitHub. Then we also had GitHub emails, and we have GitHub marketing content, such as the pricing page. And all these different pieces need to actually be crafted together to create a narrative that's seamless and you share exactly the same type of content. So for example, if a tagline is AI pair programmer, ideally you see that everywhere so that you don't see things independently. You don't see things differently each point. And that way you have the opportunity to create a more seamless narrative through the experience. So one of the gaps that I really encountered here was realizing that there's so many different pieces and touch points that my team was responsible for, and we needed to find a way to realign all these pieces so that they're all consistent and share one journey. So the question that we brought back to the team is, how may we create a consistent user journey that aligns relevant touch points for Copilot? And how do we make sure that all those touch points that you saw, the 6, are consistent? And the other challenge that I also encountered was that each of those touch points were owned by different teams. So there would be like 6 at least different teams that covered each of those elements. And imagine being a new designer joining the company and being responsible to create an end-to-end journey that is consistent across 6 different teams. I think a big challenge was, how do we create that consistency? And how do we actually create something that resonates deeply with teams? And so one of the things that I actually did was I built together a prototype that matches the vision of what I was trying to achieve so that I can share back with the team. And I'll share that prototype here. So it starts off, let me just see here. It starts off here where you're on the GitHub homepage. Then you click on Copilot, and then it takes you specifically into this marketing page. And now, as part of this marketing page, you're able to go in and start a free trial. And then from the free trial, you're able to select between different plans, confirm your payment details, select between the telemetry, which is suggestions matching code, and moving through with the actual file extension. And then beyond this, there's also what the experience looks like in the file editor itself. And in the file editor, you can go through by signing up for GitHub and going through directly into signing in. And then there's a whole other flow as well that maps more deeply into exactly what Copilot does. And then it's more lengthy here. But the intention with this is that after I mapped out all the different flows and shared the experience with my team, we started realizing all the areas where the experience could be more seamless. We started realizing, certain copy or certain language or certain designs could actually be shortened or made to be more consistent. And so overall, creating this prototype was actually very helpful in aligning to a different vision for the company. And so jumping back here, as a growth designer, a lot of my responsibilities were actually building a vision and a narrative of a seamless experience and crafting this end-to-end journey and sharing this with different folks in leadership to be able to build trust. Because as a new designer coming into a company, I didn't really have a lot of social clout, and there wasn't a lot of awareness around what I was trying to achieve. So it took a lot of relationship building to be able to get to a point where I had enough trust from the team to be able to share this vision, to be able to craft it out. And a lot of the relationship building is actually, booking one-on-ones with individuals, understanding who has the most influence, for instance, in a company and in a specific team that can actually have the most leverage in making decisions. And from understanding those individual pieces and maintaining a long-term vision of building those relationships with the stakeholders, ultimately, I found that I was really successful in essentially sharing this vision, creating a narrative, and letting the different teams know about the areas that we need to actually make consistent. So this is part of the prototyping that I brought back to various teams that was very effective in ultimately creating a long-term vision and building the trust. So now I'm actually going to shift gears a little bit and move on to more of like the live demo piece here. But I'm actually curious from the audience here, who would consider themselves a beginner when it comes to programming? Okay, a good show of hands. I'll also actually raise my hand here because I actually also consider myself a beginner. I've, taken a couple courses on HTML and CSS, but personally, I'm definitely no expert. And what I actually really found valuable about GitHub Copilot was how it actually taught me a little bit about code and how I can go through and analyze and actually understand pieces of the code because it can explain things and concepts to me in a way that was very helpful. So for instance, one of the strengths that I also want to highlight with Copilot is that it has this chat integration to be able to explain and answer questions here. I have a photo here, but let me just jump over directly to the editor and I'll show you what it means. So right now you're looking at the editor, and I just have this file open called notifications.js. And this is a file that I just created to look at some of the imports and evaluate some GitHub code. Currently, I'm actually just trying to build out design components at GitHub, and I'm new with programming. So having something like this is really helpful. And what I usually do is I'll come in, and if there's something that I don't understand, so if I'm going through and I'm wondering, okay, well, what is this use effect? What I really love is that in VS Code, you can basically right click and you can actually have Copilot explain this to you, or you can chat and ask questions to Copilot about exactly what this is. And like I mentioned, you can generate docs and tests, but let me just show you what that looks like if I ask Copilot a question about what this actually does. You can see right away that it outputs a pretty lengthy explanation, and it explains what the file does. It also explains what this particular use effect does, and it goes into a lot of detail. I will say it's not 100% accurate all the time, but it does help to save a lot of time, because instead of going on Google or searching for it online, I can have all the context directly here. And it's really helpful if I'm trying to understand specific concepts here. So this is something that I personally really love and find really helpful as well. I also played around with other features in the past, generating docs and tests, and that's been also wonderful as well. So that's one thing I'm really particularly proud of in using GitHub Copilot. I think the other thing that is more of a downside is that it actually needs a lot of sufficient context to generate really helpful code. What I mean is you sometimes might have to specify to Copilot, when I do this, I want you to change the color. Or when I do this, I want you to use this particular function. And that way you're prompting it and telling it exactly how it can help you. And I like to actually think of Copilot as a really good developer friend who's beside me, and they know just enough about what it is that I'm doing, but they don't know exactly how to help me. And the more I can tell them specifics about what I need, which is I want to make this button red, or I want to actually generate a return that outputs this particular function like this, then the more my friend can help me. And I see Copilot as a way to be able to facilitate learning, as well as a way to be able to just learn more about coding in general. So I think that's one area where it can be a little bit tedious to be able to have to write this, but it can be very helpful for Copilot to give you more sufficient code as well. And another tip here as well that I recently found, if you open multiple tabs side by side, for instance, and let's say you're doing an import of a particular library, and let's say you're importing React library. If you open the tabs side by side, Copilot can actually read your files and be able to give you better suggestions and be able to actually use the files that are open in context to what it is that you're doing. So that's another way that you can actually leverage Copilot to make your results a lot more accurate. Another thing that I like to share is that sometimes Copilot really isn't accurate, and when it outputs a suggestion, it's doing its best guess. Just like a friend, sometimes they, miss the mark a little bit, and I think that's totally okay. And one suggestion that I have is if you tap Option and the bracket, and you can actually do this in Copilot, and if you just right-click it, shows you how to do it. I'll show you right here. So for example, if you're just selecting this, and then I think you output it. Maybe it's not showing up for some reason, but there is a way where it shows up here, and then it gives you the exact prompt so that you could toggle between different suggestions. And when you're toggling through different suggestions, it's helpful, because if the first suggestion is wrong, you can always try the second one. And sometimes the second one is more accurate towards what it is that you're looking for. So that's another thing that I've realized is really helpful for my personal workflow. And ultimately, for me personally, I found that it can just speed up my workflow depending on the task that I'm interested in writing. So sometimes if I'm writing a little bit of boilerplate code, and I don't want to go on Stack Overflow, or I don't want to search up how to write this boilerplate code so that the syntax is absolutely perfect, I find that it's really helpful to just have Copilot do it and be able to say, write me some boilerplate code, and Copilot magically does it for you. And some of the research that we did in the past is we recruited about 95 developers, and we split them randomly into two groups. And we found that with the group that used Copilot, it actually saved them about an hour and a half to be able to actually, create their project and be able to write web server. Now, this kind of varies depending on the project that you're working on. But in general, we've done a lot of research here at GitHub to realize that it actually can save a lot of time and be very effective for your workflow. And that's pretty much it. I don't have anything else. Just a quick shameless plug. We also have a conference at GitHub, and if you're interested in learning a little bit more about some of the tooling that I shared around GitHub Copilot, I think we have a conference upcoming. It's free and virtual. so you can learn more about some of the tools that we have available. But I hope you found this helpful and informative, and thanks for listening. I think overall, out of all the research that we've done so far, there hasn't been a lot of long-term studies, unfortunately, just around the maintainability of the code. We're still actively coming out with new features. Like we're going to be announcing a lot more. I can't say, but we're going to be announcing a lot more really exciting features upcoming around some of the things that I've shared. And as we roll out more features, I think we'll continuously roll out more research associated with that. So you'll hopefully be able to get your answered soon. Your question answered soon. I think the most interesting was just how many moving pieces there were and how many different parts there were around collaborating with different stakeholders. Each stakeholder had just a different opinion and alignment around what they were expecting. And it was interesting to dig into how to create alignment across the company, because GitHub is overall, I think, 3,000 plus people. And a huge chunk of those people now are working on Copilot. And so one of the biggest challenges we have is how do we create consistency and alignment across what it is that we share with anything that we build. So I feel like overall we've done a really great job of creating more and more consistent experiences so that it feels like one person designed it as opposed to a lot of people designing different things. And that's one of our goals, to create the best developer experience possible for our users. When it comes to the proprietary code, we actually don't touch the private code. So anything that's proprietary, for instance, that you use privately, we don't store that information. And even when you have things like your tabs open in your file editor, we're actually also not storing that information, even if Copilot is actively learning from the file editor. And all we're doing is just applying natural language processing, as well as some metadata on top of that as well, to generate all the information you need. But anything that's privatized, proprietary, we don't store. It's mostly just the public code and anything that's in a public GitHub repository that we actually leverage for security. It's hard without divulging, especially since the universe is upcoming, and then we'll be sharing a lot about the upcoming roadmap just literally in a couple of weeks. What I can say is that we're investing more and more deeply into the future of AI, and it's definitely in our long-term company priorities that we're going to go further and further with investing into this technology, especially given all the research that we started to create and develop. You've started to see like most of the developers are starting to see value because it saves them time and it reduces boilerplate code. It creates higher quality code. And so we're probably just going to continue investing further and further into IDEs, into creating a more consistent experience with chats, and even going deeper and making the algorithm potentially more accurate. But that's my personal guess here. And I'm personally just excited about long-term increasing the productivity around developers' workflows. I think overall, I think it has a lot of potential. And for me personally, as a designer, and you yourself as well, I think it has a lot of potential to teach us more about how to learn programming and how to actually get more involved, if that's something that you're interested in. So. There's a few ways to keep the context. I think one way is offering comments directly in the code and just saying exactly what it is you need. So for example, if you're importing a specific file and you want to leverage that file from like a specific website, and then you eventually want to go deeper with that, you'll, one suggestion that I have is making a series of comments as you're coding to be able to offer more contextual cues to be able to help Copilot along. Another thing, as I mentioned, is you can also open a tab, a separate tab that's related to your file that you think might be helpful for Copilot to gain additional context. And that way, can you use the files that are open directly in your editor to be able to get extra context. And then also Copilot does really well with highlighting a specific section of the code like I showed, and then being able to actually hover your cursor around it. It's most accurate actually where your cursor is. There's a lot of technology around making sure that touch point specifically is most accurate. So if you highlight a specific section and you ask Copilot a question, then you're basically trying to maximize the potential for it to give you as accurate results as you can. And those are my personal tips. I have tried Notion, and I personally love using Notion. And I think trying it out, I think it was a pretty good experience. But I think there's a lot of AI tools out there. It's blowing up right now. So I think it's one of those things where I'm not super in the weeds with every single product.